is here.
When it comes to American muscle, few rides stir the soul like the 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge or spark debate like the 1978 Ford Mustang II King Cobra. But what made some muscle cars true legends while others left us scratching our heads? And which ones earned their spots in history, for better or worse?
There's just no resisting it. 1969 Dodge Charger.
In this video, we'll take a heartfelt cruise through 7 of the greatest and 7 of the most disappointing muscle cars ever to hit U.S. roads, looking at what made them iconic or infamous. We've pored over old car magazines, muscle car registries, collector forums, and first-hand stories to bring you a deep dive that cuts through the myths and revs up the real memories. Now, buckle up as we kick things off with a legendary machine that practically defined an era of raw American horsepower. 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge. Let's begin with a legend that practically owned the streets. The 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge. Do you remember the first time you heard one roar down your block? That deep, thunderous rumble that made every head turn? It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. By 1970, the muscle car wars were in full swing, and Pontiac had something to prove. The GTO Judge wasn't just about power, though with its ROM Air 4 V8 pushing up to 370 horsepower, it had plenty. It was about attitude. That eye-popping orbit orange paint, bold "The Judge" decals, and rear spoiler weren't optional. They were the point. You didn't buy a Judge if you wanted to blend in. You bought one to lead the pack. Sliding behind the wheel, you felt like you were part of a special club. The interior smelled of new vinyl and pure adrenaline. Maybe you remember cruising with your buddies, 8-track tapes, blaring some Creedence or Hendrix, windows down, and the summer air buzzing with energy. Even if you never owned one, chances are you knew someone who did. Or at least you knew exactly when one was nearby. Pop culture embraced the Judge, too. It wasn't long before songs like Little GTO and countless Hollywood chase scenes turned the GTO into a pop icon. The 1970 model marked the peak before rising insurance costs and stricter emissions standards started putting the brakes on the muscle car era. It's no wonder the 70 GTO Judge remains one of the most revered names whenever car lovers talk about the golden age of American horsepower. Next up, we'll hit the brakes a little and take a look at one of the biggest misfires in muscle car history. 1978 Ford Mustang II King Cobra. Next on the list, we swerve into a muscle car misstep that still stirs heated debates. The 1978 Ford Mustang II King Cobra. Now, if you grew up loving the original Mustangs, the ones that made Steve McQueen look even cooler in Bullitt, the Mustang II probably felt like a gut punch. Introduced during a rough patch for American automakers, the King Cobra was Ford's attempt to inject some muscle back into the lineup after the oil crisis, rising insurance premiums and tightening emissions. Regulations had tamed the wild ponies of the late 60s, but instead of raw power, what you mostly got was flash. Sure, the King Cobra came with an eye-catching snake decal sprawled across the hood, aggressive ground effects, and flashy stripes. It looked fast, but under that hood, the V8 only managed about 139 horsepower. That's right, 139. Maybe you remember seeing one parked at your local high school, its proud owner revving the engine in the parking lot, trying to wring every ounce of bravado from that struggling motor. It sounded tough at idle, but once it hit the road, it was more bark than bite. Still, the King Cobra had its charms. It was lightweight and relatively affordable, and to a teenager in 1978, it felt like the dream of old-school muscle wasn't entirely dead. It just needed a few years and a few thousand RPMs to wake back up. Today, some collectors have a soft spot for the King Cobra's sheer audacity, but there's no denying it stands more as a colorful footnote than a true chapter in muscle car greatness. Coming up, we'll revisit a beast that redefined what it meant to rule the road. 1969. Dodge Charger Daytona. Sliding into third, we revisit a machine so outrageous it changed American racing and street cred forever. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. Can you picture it? That mile-long nose, that towering rear wing that looked like it belonged on a rocket ship instead of a car. When the Daytona hit the scene, jaws dropped and competitors scrambled. Born out of pure necessity, the Daytona was Dodge's secret weapon to dominate NASCAR. In the late 60s, Ford and Mercury had been stealing the spotlight, and Dodge wasn't about to be left behind. So they went radical. A slope aerodynamic nose cone for slicing through the air, and that signature 23-inch tall wing to keep the rear wheels planted at high speeds. Underneath, the 440 Magnum V8, or the optional 426 Hemi, meant business pushing well over 400 horsepower. Maybe you spotted one at the A&W drive-in. Its massive spoiler is sticking up over the roof of every other car in the lot. It looked and sounded like something from another world. And here's the kicker. The Daytona was so successful on the track, NASCAR eventually banned it, changing the rules to curb its overwhelming advantage. Owning one today is like holding a piece of untouchable American automotive legend. Only about 500 were ever made for the streets, just enough to meet racing rules. If you knew someone who had one, or were lucky enough to ride in one, you knew you were experiencing something truly rare. 1970. Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454. Now this was muscle at its most unapologetic. The 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 wasn't just another pretty face on the boulevard. It was a brute, a legend, and maybe even the king of the stoplight drag races you used to watch, or maybe sneak into. When you popped the hood and saw that LS6 454 cubic inch V8 staring back at you, you knew it meant serious business. 450 horsepower of pure, tire-melting American muscle. Driving one felt like strapping yourself to a cannonball. That deep, rumbling exhaust note was enough to make your heart race before you even touched the gas pedal. You might remember watching Chevelles storm through small-town streets, leaving long black streaks on the asphalt and wide grins on every face within earshot. They were everywhere. From car shows to high school parking lots, symbols of raw American power and a golden age that even then felt fleeting. Even today, the 70 Chevelle SS 454 is one of the most sought-after muscle cars among collectors. It's a reminder of a time when bigger was better, louder was cooler, and nobody cared if you burned a little extra rubber getting home. 1974 AMC Matador Coupe. Remember when American Motors decided to take a swing at the personal luxury car market? The 1974 AMC Matador Coupe was their answer. Boy, was it a head-scratcher. Designed with swooping, almost futuristic lines, the Matador tried hard to look bold and different, maybe too hard. Critics and car lovers alike were puzzled. Was it a muscle car, a luxury cruiser, a spaceship? Under the hood, the Matador could be optioned with a 401 cubic inch V8, but by 1974, horsepower ratings were plunging faster than disco balls at a Saturday night dance party. The once proud performance numbers struggled to keep up with the Matador's hefty weight, and the ride leaned more towards soft and floaty than sharp and aggressive. You might remember spotting these oddballs cruising around in the mid-70s, maybe even catching one painted in wild, two-tone colors, straight out of a Starsky and Hutch episode. While AMC deserves credit for daring to be different, the Matador Coupe never quite found its footing, and today it mostly lives on as a quirky footnote in muscle car history. 1967 Shelby GT 500. If you ever dreamed of the perfect marriage between raw American muscle and refined performance engineering, the 1967 Shelby GT 500 probably sits right at the top of your list. It wasn't just a Mustang, it was the Mustang. Carroll Shelby took the already beloved pony car and turned it into a full-fledged street warrior, powered by a monstrous 428 cubic inch Police Interceptor V V8 that delivered jaw-dropping torque and heart-pounding acceleration. Just imagine rolling up to the local diner on a Saturday night, the rumble of your GT 500 shaking windows before you even parked. Its wide stance, scooped hood, and aggressive front end announced you weren't messing around. And thanks to Hollywood, this beauty became even more legendary. Gone in 60 Seconds burned the Shelby GT 500 into the dreams of gearheads everywhere. Owning one back then meant you were part of a rare, enviable club. Today, it's the stuff of collector fantasies, a true testament to the golden era of muscle, and a reminder that sometimes bigger dreams did come true right out of Detroit. 1979, Oldsmobile 442. The 442, just hearing the name, might make you smile. But by 1979, this once proud muscle car had become almost unrecognizable. If you were around during the late 60s, you remember when the Oldsmobile 442 was a legitimate street beast. 400-plus horsepower, thunderous exhaust notes, and a bold presence that could stand toe-to-toe with anything else Detroit had to offer. Fast forward to 1979, and it was a much sadder story, thanks to rising gas prices, stricter emission standards, and a shift toward personal luxury cars. The 442 badges had been slapped onto a relatively tame Cutlass Calais. Instead of a fire-breathing V8 under the hood, most 7944s came with a 5.0-liter, 305 cubic inch V8, producing a meager 160 horsepower at best. That's right, you got a fancy tape stripe package, some bucket seats, and a 442 badge, but not much muscle to back it up. Imagine the disappointment of sliding behind the wheel, expecting a snappy launch when you stomped on the gas, only to be met with a sluggish groan. Maybe you even remember a neighbor proudly showing off their brand new 7944-2, only for the teenage car nuts down the block to snicker behind their backs. It wasn't just about speed, it was the loss of attitude that hurt the most. The 79 Olds 442 wasn't entirely without charm. It rode smoothly, it looked sharp in the right light, but for anyone who knew what the name once meant, it was a bittersweet reminder that the muscle car era was truly coming to an end. 1971, Plymouth Hemi Cuda. If there's one muscle car that practically roars just by you thinking about it, it's the 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda. Even today, just saying the name sends a little jolt of excitement through your spine. Back in the early 70s, when gas was cheap and the open road called out to every teenager with a lead foot, the Cuda was the ultimate street brawler, the muscle car that other muscle cars were afraid of. Powered by the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi 5.8, the 71 Hemi Cuda wasn't just fast, it was ferocious. With 425 horsepower under your right foot and a thunderous exhaust note that could rattle storefront windows, this car turned every stoplight into a potential drag race. The styling, absolutely unforgettable. The menacing twin hood scoops, bold shaker scoop option, billboard, side graphics, and that iconic fish gill grille made it look just as aggressive, standing still as it did roaring past you at 100 miles an hour. You might remember seeing one pull into a parking lot at the A&W or rumble down the local strip on a Friday night, the crowd parting like the Red Sea just to get a better look. For a brief, glorious moment, the Hemi Cuda was the king of the American roads, a pure, undiluted symbol of the muscle car's peak. Sadly, 1971 also marked the beginning of the end. Insurance rates were skyrocketing, emissions regulations were tightening, and public taste was shifting. Plymouth sold very few Hemi Cudas that year, making original examples today some of the rarest, most valuable classic cars in existence. If you're lucky enough to have even seen one up close, you know it's like standing next to a living, breathing piece of automotive mythology. The 1971 Hemi Cuda wasn't just a muscle car, it was the muscle car, the one that decades later still makes your heart race and your imagination fire on all cylinders. 1976 Chevrolet Monza 2+2 V8. At first glance, the 1976 Chevrolet Monza 2+2 looked like it might just be the next big thing in American performance. It had a sporty, aerodynamic design, a fastback shape that whispered speed, and Chevy even managed to shoehorn a V8 engine under the hood. You might have seen it gleaming in dealership windows or proudly sitting in someone's driveway, giving off the vibe of a mini-muscle car ready to tear up the streets. But once you got behind the wheel, reality hit hard. Despite its promising looks, the Monza 2+2 delivered more frustration than fun. The available 5.7-liter V8 seemed like a dream on paper, but thanks to strict emissions controls and detuning, it churned out just 140 horsepower, barely enough to make the Monza feel lively, let alone fast. Handling wasn't much better. It was nose-heavy and prone to understeer, not exactly inspiring confidence when you tried to channel your inner race car driver. Then there was the build quality, or lack thereof. Interior rattles, cheap materials, and questionable reliability were all too common. You might remember a friend constantly trying to keep their Monza on the road, battling mysterious electrical issues, or rust that seemed to set in before the first oil change. It's not that the Monza 2+2 didn't try, it just couldn't deliver on the promise its sleek exterior made. In an era when muscle cars were already fading, the Monza felt like a sad reminder of what had been lost. A muscle car in name only, it left drivers longing for the real fire-breathing machines of just a few years earlier. 1968 Pontiac Firebird 400. If there was ever a car that perfectly blended everyday drivability with true muscle car firepower, it was the 1968 Pontiac Firebird 400. You didn't have to be a seasoned drag racer to fall head over heels for it, just a regular kid dreaming big every time you spotted that sleek body gliding down Main Street. Pontiac had already struck gold with the GTO, but the Firebird brought that same swagger to a slightly smaller, lighter package. The 400 cubic inch V8 delivered a hearty 330 horsepower, giving you the kind of off-the-line punch that made every stoplight a temptation. You might remember hearing that throaty exhaust burble echoing through suburban neighborhoods, or catching a flash of those slit-like taillights as someone stomped the gas and disappeared around a corner. Unmistakable split-front grille that screamed Pontiac performance. Inside, the cockpit was pure late 60s cool. Bucket seats, a wood-grain dashboard, and an optional hood-mounted tachometer that made you feel like a professional racer every time you shifted gears. Maybe you even remember a buddy's older brother pulling up in one after school, Firebird rumbling like a caged beast just waiting to be unleashed. It wasn't just a car, it was a ticket to freedom, wrapped in gleaming chrome and candy-colored paint. The 1968 Firebird 400 proved you didn't have to spend big money or wrestle an oversized land yacht to enjoy pure American muscle. It was fast, fun, and just rebellious enough to make every drive feel like your own little act of revolution. Quick reminder, while we're deep in muscle car heaven, if you're enjoying this trip down memory lane, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've still got a few unforgettable classics and a couple more head-scratchers coming up. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. 1977. Dodge Charger Daytona. Hearing the name Daytona usually makes your heart race a little faster. After all, the original 1969 Charger Daytona was one of the most iconic, aggressive muscle cars ever built. But by 1977, that legendary name had been tacked onto a very different and frankly disappointing machine. The 1977 Dodge Charger Daytona was a far cry from its late 60s namesake. By this point, the Charger had ballooned into a cushy, heavy personal luxury car. focused more on vinyl roofs and opera windows than speed and performance. Dodge tried to recapture some excitement by slapping the Daytona name onto a trim package featuring bold decals, flashy colors, and cosmetic touches like spoilers and stripes. Unfortunately, under the flashy paint, there was no real performance magic waiting. Most models came with modest 318 or 360 cubic inch Vaux 8s, tuned for emission standards and fuel economy rather than raw power. Even if you splurged on a 400 or 440 V8, the bloated curb weight and strangled horsepower left you feeling like you were dragging an anchor, not piloting a race car. You might remember a friend rolling up in a brand new 1977 Daytona, only for everyone to realize that while it looked fast, it couldn't outrun even some sedans from the same era. The saddest part? It wasn't even entirely Dodge's fault. By the late 70s, American automakers were trapped between soaring insurance costs, new federal regulations, and a customer base that suddenly wanted plush interiors more than quarter-mile times. Still, seeing the proud Daytona script slapped onto a bloated cruiser hurt, and it remains one of the biggest missed opportunities in muscle car history. 1965 Buick Grand Sport. When you think of muscle cars, Buick might not be the first name that pops into your head, but the 1965 Buick Grand Sport sure earned its spot in the Hall of Fame. Back when GTOs and Mustangs were grabbing headlines, Buick quietly unleashed a serious heavyweight contender, giving drivers a potent blend of luxury and street-fighting performance. The Grand Sport was based on the Skylark, but Buick engineers weren't messing around. They wedged a monstrous 401 cubic inch nailhead Vaux 8 under the hood, an engine so big and burly that Buick rounded up the numbers and called it a 400 just to stay within GM's corporate limits. You got 325 horsepower and a whopping 445 pound-feet of torque, enough to launch this mid-size coupe down the street like a guided missile. You might remember the feeling of sliding into those plush bucket seats, turning the key, and hearing that low, menacing rumble come to life. Out on the open road, the Grand Sport could cruise effortlessly or light up the rear tires with just a tap of the accelerator. It was the kind of car that looked a little more refined at first glance, but the moment you punched it, all bets were off. While your neighbors might have been showing off their flashy Mustangs and GTOs, owning a Grand Sport was like being part of a secret club, a nod from one gearhead to another that you knew exactly where true power lived. And best of all, you got it wrapped in Buick's famously smooth ride and understated class. The 1965 Buick Grand Sport proved you didn't have to sacrifice comfort for pure performance. It was, and still is, one of the finest sleeper muscle cars America ever built. 1980 Pontiac Trans Am Turbo. Do you remember the first time you laid eyes on a turbocharged car and thought, this has got to be fast? Well, if that car happened to be the 1980 Pontiac Trans Am Turbo, you might have been in for a real surprise, and not the good kind. Riding high on the coattails of the original Smokey and the Bandit fame, Pontiac needed the next Trans Am to be just as flashy, even if it couldn't back it up. On paper, the idea sounded thrilling. A 4.9-liter Turbo V8 with a cool hood bulge, proudly declaring Turbo 4.9. The reality, though, a measly 210 horsepower in a car that weighed over 3,500 pounds. When you mashed the gas, you got more noise than movement, and a lot of confused looks if you expected real muscle. Even the special turbo gauges in the center console couldn't trick you into feeling fast. For many of us, seeing a Trans Am on the street back then still made your heart race. Burt Reynolds had made sure of that. But if you actually owned or drove a 1980 turbo model, chances are you learned pretty quickly that looks can be deceiving. It felt like showing up to a high school reunion, looking the part, but forgetting every cool story you meant to tell. And yet, there's a weird kind of fondness for these underachievers today. Maybe because they remind us that even legends can stumble and still look darn good doing it. Now, for something a lot closer to the muscle car glory we remember, 1970, Oldsmobile 442 W30. Some muscle cars didn't just live up to the hype, they shattered it. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30 was one of those beasts, and if you were lucky enough to ride in one, you know exactly what I mean. It was the kind of car that made your heart pound before you even turned the key. Under the hood, it packed a massive 455 cubic inch V8, producing a thundering 370 horsepower and an eye-popping 500 pound-feet of torque. And when you paired it with the lightweight W30 package, complete with a fiberglass hood, functional air scoops, and factory blueprinted engines, it became a street-legal rocket ship. You didn't just drive a 442 W30, you commanded it. Stylistically, it was pure muscle, bold stripes, W30 badges, and an attitude that dared any other car to line up next to it at a red light. Maybe you remember gripping that iconic Hurst shifter, cranking the AM radio to catch some Grand Funk Railroad or CCR, and just feeling invincible. It wasn't just a car, it was a badge of honor. The 442 W30 had something so many muscle cars tried and failed to capture. A real performance that lived up to the bold looks. Even today, spotting one at a car show brings a flood of memories about freedom, raw power, and a time when American muscle truly ruled the streets. But as we know all too well, not every ride from that era earned such respect. 1974, Ford Gran Torino Elite. Sometimes a name can only carry you so far. In 1974, Ford tried to capitalize on the fading muscle car craze by introducing the Gran Torino Elite, a car that looked like it meant business, but under the surface was more about cushy cruising than burning rubber. If you remember seeing one parked on a neighbor's driveway, you might recall it looked a lot tougher than it actually was. Built more for comfort than speed, the Elite was heavy, bloated, and powered by engines strangled by new emissions regulations. Even the largest V8 option, a 460 cubic inch monster, struggled to move the nearly 2-ton bulk with anything resembling urgency. Instead of growling off the line, it kind of groaned its way through traffic, all while the driver sank into a sea of vinyl and faux wood trim. Sure, the styling had some flash, hidden headlights, a formal grille, and luxury touches that tried to blur the line between muscle and personal luxury coupe. But deep down, enthusiasts knew this wasn't the Torino of the early 70s anymore. This was Ford signaling the end of an era, sluggish mile at a time. Still, there's something oddly charming about seeing a Gran Torino Elite today, almost like spotting a retired prizefighter. You remember what once was and what could have been, and it makes you wonder, which do you miss more? The raw, roaring muscle cars that thrilled us, or the luxurious cruisers that quietly signaled the end of their reign? Let us know in the comment section below.